Theodore Roethke has had an outsized influence on American poetry in the 20th century. And for all of that a remarkable influence on fellow poets and the reception and expectations of poetry generally, his legacy comes down to several lyrics that are very significant, but by far the most commonly known one, the most anthologized one, is a relatively short lyric, 4 stanzas, 16 lines, called "My Papa's Waltz." The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death, such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf, my mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle, at every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. A little dark, little suggestion of domestic violence there, of an abusive father. Now, Rothke did have a complicated relationship with his father, and he plumbs that obliquely in a lot of his work. Otto Rothke was a German immigrant who was very different in temperament, supposedly, than his son. His son was more of an introvert. His son was a little bit more delicate, perhaps. And Otto was apparently much more of an aggressive, unexpressive German, let's say. And you get a portrait of a perhaps alcoholism in this, where the father comes home perhaps late at night and starts acting uproariously, and from the child's perspective. And here Rothke is putting himself, or at least the narrator is putting himself in the view of a child, of not really understanding what's going on. You get the sense that this is a fairly young child who doesn't recognize that, something is off here. Now, perhaps that means that this kind of behavior is not infrequent in that household. So it's just one more, okay, Daddy came home and he's a little bit odd tonight, and we just have to deal with this for now. But it's also a memory of that disturbance that is really so unique in this, because it is the narrator perhaps recalling through the prism of his own understanding, his own maturity now, what is going on, and is still infantilized into that moment where even a presumably adult narrative voice, is having a hard time processing this. And the trauma of those moments is so remarkable that it drags the adult narrator back into the perspective of the child. Now, the poem itself is fairly simple. It has all of Rothke's earmarks of being relatively simple language, fairly short words, just very punchy. Obviously, it is also a waltz. That is a very regular-ish 3/4 time signature on this. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. It is very regular in that way, but also you heard me sort of stumble in one in the middle there, but it does sort of break down occasionally. It is slightly irregular in rhythm and also in rhyme. Obviously, dizzy and easy, I don't know about the accent that he's working with in Saginaw, Michigan at this point, but it's a little off. So like somebody who is trying to dance or keep a beat when they're perhaps impaired by alcohol, the rhythm is just a little bit off. The reality is just a little off. The expectations are just a little bit off. And so it's got a little bit of a jangly feel to it. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. That is very hard to fit into the rhythm. And whenever you see among all of these words that are fairly short, and simple, the word countenance jumps out to me, and you see this in Roethke occasionally, and modernist poets of his ilk, where a conspicuously longer or more nuanced word, a countenance, even if you let go of the rhyme issue, and there are other words I'm sure that they could get in there for a one or two syllable thing, but countenance is so arch, it's so irregular, that embedded within this otherwise very simple vocabulary poem is curious, and that draws attention to that face. And you can imagine the mother standing there in the kitchen watching her husband, and this is probably a fairly patriarchal relationship here, watching her husband essentially physically abuse their son. And that curiosity of the word focuses on that face, focuses on the irregularity of that face, where she is perhaps trying to be quiet and tolerant, and maybe even putting on a little smile to pretend that everything is fine. But there's something weird about it. There's something strange about it. There's something irregular about it that is reflected in the trauma that this moment is creating, that this moment is resonating with for a narrator who is probably thinking back to that childhood moment. And it does get kind of ugly. In the very first line, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. Okay, well, that's a disturbing sensory experience. Roethke is always good about just these simple sensory experiences, but I hung on like death, and hung on like death. All right, maybe that's an expression, but like death gets that word death in there, and that's a little bit extra threatening. Such waltzing was not easy, and like, oh well, waltzing, well, okay, that's just sort of silly then, it's very lighthearted, right? So there's a little bit of conflict in the line from the line to line structure. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Well, why? Maybe he just came in from a night out at a bar, and things got rough, and he's coming home with a bloody knuckle. Or maybe the knuckle was made bloody once he got there at the house. That's really suggestive and excruciating. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. That word "scraped" is especially poignant there. You beat time on my head. I'm imagining, child abuse. Palm caked hard by dirt. Remember, Otto Roethke ran a greenhouse, and he worked with dirt. So his hands and probably under his fingernails were especially cracked and dirty at all times. Then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. Still clinging. Now, is that a clinging out of desperation to hold on? Maybe. Is that clinging out of a kind of vestigial attachment to your father, even in the most abusive and ugly moments? Possibly. That is that's an interesting notion that just brings you back into this poem that is ugly. Now, it's very short, so it gets anthologized all over the place. It's very catchy, so, you can read it aloud, and it almost has, it's almost fun, and then you get into it, but it's not all fun and games. Look at this, and look at that. Okay. It goes well in a classroom situation like that, and you can print it very easily in an anthology or a magazine or something like that. It doesn't take up too much room, and all those things lend, the possibilities of popularity. But there is an undeniable power in this lyric. There is an undeniable beauty in the resilience of this child trying to hold on, clinging to his father. There's something quite touching of watching a poetic narrator uh, trying to come to terms with painful situations from what is probably decades before.